Hey, before we get going here, let me remind you that if you're not already a subscriber, please become one so you don't miss anything. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/wardcarroll. Thanks. Now, when Frank Borman joined NASA and was selected to command the first mission to orbit the moon, that meant his wife Susan had to put on a brave face for the world as her husband risked his life for the space race. The pressure and anxiety were overwhelming, and eventually Susan's well-hidden depression and alcoholism came to light. Frank finally had to come to terms with how his mission above all else mentality contributed to his wife's suffering. Now, this untold story of the Bormans is captured in a new book called Far Side of the Moon, Apollo 8 Commander Frank Borman and the Woman Who Gave Him Wings, by author Lisa Jorgensen. Lisa and her husband, Michael, a filmmaker, joined me from their home in Alberta recently to talk about this topic in great detail. Like many things in life, the Bormans' fairy tale existence was not quite that. So let's go back to the early days, because here he is, the football star, and she's the hometown beauty queen.
Yeah.
So on paper, they were sort of bound for great success. And they had that at once. Then the public eye, they were, who wouldn't want to be Frank Borman in the 60s, right? But they had a dark side, which, we'll explore as we go along here. But let's go back to the sort of American Gothic, their hometown sort of startup. Talk about their courtship.
Frank basically fell in love with her at first sight at a dance. And he was, as you mentioned, the quarterback, and she was this beautiful, tall, willowy blonde, and he just kind of fell head over heels. And so they started dating when Susan was 15 and dated basically his last year of high school. All through his last year of high school, they got very serious very quickly. And then Frank was off to West Point. And he realized when he got there that this was going to involve everything he had to give. And Frank being Frank, mission comes first. He broke up with Susan because he just thought he didn't have time for a relationship. And then basically regretted it almost immediately and spent the next 4 years writing letters and essentially launching a campaign to get her back. And she had dated some other guys during that point, but still kept in contact with him. And she was actually quite serious with someone when Frank graduated and basically got in his car, drove home to Arizona, and called her and said, "I want to take you for dinner." And he popped the question. He had a ring in his pocket, and she said yes, and then had to break up with her serious boyfriend, and they got married right away.
Well, leaving out a detail, if we were to make a movie out of this, we wouldn't leave this scene out. Where the boyfriend shows up, or what happened there, and there was a fight. I mean, he had to
there was a
kick
fight
his ass, right?
in the yard, and Frank has to put him down. And it was obviously pretty dramatic, but it was, it's a great movie scene for sure. And it was fun.
Classic, right? I mean, was she engaged to that guy, or they were very serious?
They were already talking that way, that they were, kind of planning a future together. So
so what Frank wants, Frank gets, kind of a thing, right? He just, as you said, he was focused at West Point, and then suddenly he's like, I think I love her. Right. And he just comes back and he's like, "You're mine." And she was kind of up for it, right? Because I think she had, had still feelings for him in spite of the fact that he broke up with her, obviously.
Yeah.
And so now they're together and off they go to flight school and this trajectory of the U.S. Air Force. And what struck me with some of these early places they live is just how Spartan, to be polite about it, the living arrangements were. Because this has been profiled in movies like The Right Stuff and stuff, but it's really, really like kind of ghetto where they wind up living and what she's put through while he's focused on first getting his wings and then being a jet guy and then TPS and everything else.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And that was something that, again, was really fun to research, but also really drove home how amazing these women were, that they had to deal with unbelievable conditions, and they usually had small children. The washroom facilities were brutal. Like it was very challenging, and it was that way at just about every base they went to.
So the thing about this is, in this era, so we're talking the 50s, the Air Force particularly didn't really care about families. There was no family services. It was like, if we wanted you to have a wife, we'd issue you one, ha, 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 right? Kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So this becomes the theme for the spouses. It almost gets worse at NASA. But certainly during these days, and because he's so focused, he's not home a whole lot, and she's in these desert, ramshackle places. As you said, sometimes there's not running water, there's no facilities, there's nothing around her. You know, so you're thinking how glamorous to be a fighter pilot's wife, right? And it's not at all that. I mean, it's the contrast between even a lieutenant in the Navy's existence now and his spouse, and what Susan Borman was going through is just amazing to me.
Yeah, I agree. And it was, again, just another thing that impressed me so much about her and all of the other wives that just did it. They had the same mentality as their husbands. It's like, this is an important thing, and this is my part, and I will do my part, and I won't complain. I will just suck it up and do what needs to be done.
So we'll accelerate through the first part of his career so we can get to the NASA part, which is basically the meat of the story.
Yes.
Gets jets, doesn't go to Korea, for which he's very frustrated. So he misses the war.
Yes.
Long story short, winds up going to test pilot school, doing very well, and gets selected for which class of NASA astronauts was this? Was this the second class? So you have the Mercury 7, and then the second class includes Frank Borman.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Frank was part of the what they called the New Nine. So Frank became an astronaut in September of 1962, and you know it's interesting because Frank didn't apply to be an astronaut. He was actually handpicked by General Curtis LeMay, who's iconic, and his is a great story in of itself. But Frank was picked by the Air Force, and the only reason Frank wanted to be an astronaut was that he wanted to get into combat, and he thought this was going to be the best way to beat the Russians. I mean, he had been at Edwards during that whole Century series of fighters. That was a real kind of the apex of test flight for back in the 50s and 60s. So Frank kind of became an astronaut just because he wanted, again, to get into, he missed out on Korea. He actually told, Lisa, that was, one of the great regrets of his life, that he actually wasn't in combat. So he felt this was the best way to beat the Russians.
So let's remind the viewers, and we've dealt with this in a few other episodes, the Area 51 episode, and basically anytime I deal with UFOs, Project Blue Book, just how intense the Cold War was at this time. And that's what informed the space race. It was a head-to-head competition with the Soviet Union. As you guys point out in this book, they were winning at certain points, spacewalking and different things. And so Frank, being the ultimate competitor, and as you said, Michael, he missed the war. So this is basically his way to fight the Russian horde. And so, again, this is what drives him in such an intense way to not just do the job, but to excel in everything. So they move. Where did they go from Edwards to Houston? Where was it they moved from when they joined NASA?
Yeah, when they left, Edwards, Yeager told him, Chuck Yeager was Frank's boss and said he was basically destroying his Air Force career. So they went right from Edwards to Houston in the fall of 1962.
So that's an interesting point, right? So this choice, which seems so antiseptic and self-evident now, did come with, at the time, the matrix was very complicated. So here's a guy who has a very viable Air Force career. You know, I mean, he could have made general officer. He could have been the chief of staff. Who knows, right? He was number one in everything that he ever did. And so no less than Chuck Yeager says, you know, and he's famously was not selected for the astronaut program because he was not a college grad, right? Which is documented in both the book, The Right Stuff, and the movie.
Yeah.
And so he's got a kind of a problem with this whole NASA thing, Chuck does. And he puts it to Frank, you're making the wrong choice, basically, is what he says to him, right?
Yeah, and Frank told, General Yeager, in not so many words, but Frank has said this to, many people throughout his career, that, Yeager didn't know his ass from third base. So Frank knew he was doing the right thing, and he had Susan's full support, and off they went to, begin training at NASA for his Gemini flight.
So again, they moved from this desert third world existence in the greater Edwards area, which is still kind of living in, Kabul or someplace. I mean, there's not a whole lot in Edwards even today. But in fact, what cracked me up when I haven't been there too many times, but the distance from the main gate to the runway is still like another 15 miles, So he moves to Houston. They moved to Houston. How many kids do they have by this point?
2.
Okay, so they had 2 kids.
They're 2 boys, yeah.
Okay, and but it's still not a very luxurious life when they get to Houston.
No, and in fact, NASA didn't have anything set up. The one thing that Susan was used to, and all the wives were used to, is when you get to base, there is some structure, and you are told, go here for this and go here for that, and there's some support. NASA had nothing, so these women had to figure out where they were going to live. And they developed a whole community at El Lago, but they were the ones who had to do it all. And they had to get their homes built. They had a swimming pool built for their children to use. And they were the ones who basically did all of that and created that community because NASA had nothing in place for them.
So fighter pilots tend to marry type A, women, let's just say. And so to your point, Lisa, these spouses are not going to just sit down and not improve their lot insofar as they had the means to do so.
Yeah.
Right? Because at NASA's feet, there was nothing that was going to be solved for them. And they figured this out like pretty quickly right away. So that came with the goodness of what you're talking about, swimming pools and different things. But there was also this part that this insidious sort of metaphysics that starts to take hold in certain of the spouses, and it manifests itself in a whole bunch of ways. So we'll get to that. So what was Frank's first job at NASA?
At the time, Deke Slayton was his boss, and he put him in charge of boosters for the Gemini program. So that was really Frank's first job. And then, Deke saw that Frank and Lovell had, there was a lot in common between those two guys. I think Deke, famously said, if you tell Borman and Lovell to take the hill, Lovell will think about it. He'll make sure that he's got a plan, and Borman will be out of the hole before you finish telling him what the mission is. So that's why he decided that, might be a good idea to pair these guys up on the first long duration flight, Gemini flight, to prove that humans could stay in space for, it's going to take at least 10 days to go to the moon and back. So they decided to put, Lovell and Borman in the Gemini capsule, which is like putting 2 cockpits of 2 A4s together, incredibly small, and let them circle the Earth for 14 days and see how that worked out. So they actually did the first rendezvous. They actually didn't dock, but they rendezvoused with Wally Schirra, who was in Gemini 6, I believe. So they flew within like a foot of each other.
So let's remind the viewers, because I was reminded reading the book, that the NASA space program to the Apollo program, was a building block all to putting men on the moon, right? In accordance with President Kennedy's sort of famous edict, we'll do the other things, or however he said it, and do the hard things and put a man on the moon by the end of this decade. And so start with Mercury. Then, as you said, Michael, Gemini was to prove that we could stay in space for more than just 15 minutes or whatever. But each mission was built on the previous one towards this thing, which is called land on the moon and walk around and so forth and so on. And so Gemini was phase 2, and then Apollo was the phase 3 part. And this is what really does inform Frank's involvement and Frank's focus and Frank's challenges.
When Frank was scheduled to fly and command Apollo 9, but then the Apollo 1 fire happened, claimed the life of his best friend, Ed White, and Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee. And that changed the whole trajectory of Frank's, career, and or at least his part in Apollo, because I submit, and other people have said this and totally said this from the Apollo program, that no Frank Borman, no man on the moon by 1970. The NASA put Frank in front and led the investigation into the fire. Frank also was sent to North America, now Downey, California, to lead the redesign of the Block 2 command module. So it just makes sense. So we're when they found, CIA learned that it looked like the Russians had plans to send a manned mission around the moon before the end of 1968, that they picked Frank to command that Apollo 8 mission and moved him from Apollo 9 down to 8.
So I want to do a deeper dive on the Apollo 1 investigation, but Lisa, let's pivot to focusing on Susan's, because these things exist in parallel, like Michael was just saying. So there was some evidence of some challenges during his Gemini mission. There's a lot of obviously TV focus and, cameras parked on your lawn and that sort of thing. And she was sort of doing some cries for help even then that were kind of going unanswered.
Yeah, I mean, she got criticized for the Gemini flight, that famous photo of her turning away and holding on to her boys when the Gemini 7 launched, and it just made national headlines. So she kind of got pegged as the scared wife instead of the proud wife. And I thought her rebuttal was so classy, because she did write an article to the newspaper and just said, I'm a wife who loves her husband and is concerned for his safety, and I can't pretend otherwise. So I was just being real instead of fake. And there were a lot of women, obviously, who related to that, but she did get criticized, and it's kind of how she's been represented, because she wore her heart on her sleeve, and it was very challenging. And this is the most untested, untried technology that Frank had ever been involved with. So she was a smart woman. She understood what the risks were, and the risks were high.
But NASA had no support for the spouses. They were just expected to be there, as you say, be stoic, like, Jackie Kennedy kind of look, and
exactly,
and no emotions. And as we're talking about here, she flinched, or she showed some emotion or some idea that she might have been scared, and pegged the scared wife. So it's hard to, in this day and age or even during the shuttle program, right, to tell a young person just what a national event the launch of a NASA mission was in those days, right? I mean, that was must-watch TV. We'd get out of school. If we were at school, we'd stop class and watch it on the TV. If we had TV in our classroom, or we all gather in the cafeteria and watch it on a little TV. But this was a big deal. Each Gemini mission, each Apollo mission was a big deal. And so the astronauts were like the Beatles.
They were.
And so we knew who each one of them was. They were national celebrities. You ask a 15-year-old, hey, can you name one astronaut now? They would be unable to, right? So we need to just, certainly my core audience is old enough to understand what I'm talking about, but I want any of our younger viewers to just understand just how bright these Klieg lights were and how little to no support Susan Borman had and the other spouses had. And they all sort of managed it in different ways. I love the line that Gene Cernan's wife said about, what was it, the one about martinis, or what was her line?
Well, she had given this really wonderful kind of speech about what it's really like to be an astronaut's wife, and it was so well delivered that it kind of made national press. So that was the one time her husband said, "Wow, you're getting more attention right now than I am." But her rebuttal to that was, "I can do anything with 3 martinis and a couple of Valium." It's like, wow.
That's such a mother's little helper, kind of a era Mad Men 60s, quintessential survival thing. And again, let's just paint the landscape, the pop culture piece, right? So we've already said the Beatles, but there's also Vietnam War going on. It's where women's right is still not a thing, right? ERA is kind of percolating a little bit. Roe v. Wade is, I guess, just happened. And, the things that we take for granted in terms of equality and social norms back in this day were not established, right? So as much as the astronauts were pioneers, so were these wives in terms of how do you be the support mechanism for this incredible, unprecedented, not just an astronaut, but this public figure, and again, some of this is mentioned in the right stuff about, the Mercury astronauts, who some did it right, some did it, let's just say, wrong in terms of leveraging their celebrity. Obviously, Frank Borman's a straight arrow. He's like a John Glenn kind of guy where, he's not going to be a rock star. And he's focused, right? So, Michael, you were talking about Apollo 1, the horrors of Apollo 1, a very gruesome mishap. And I would invite the audience to listen to the actual audio of that, but probably not, because it is very graphic how these guys died. I think the only good news is they probably died of asphyxia and not from burning. But this was a very gruesome mishap where the 3 astronauts were killed in a flash fire on the launch pad doing a test run. It wasn't even something that was designed as a point towards the airplane or the rocket actually launching. So as you mentioned, Frank gets the lead. So his best friend and other 2 colleagues have died, and the NASA program is on the verge of getting shut down because this is the confluence of a whole bunch of stuff. Funding is at risk. They're not sure that they can do it without killing more guys. And the Russians are now taking the lead in a big way. They're like, well, they already won, right? So everybody's kind of ready to just throw their hands up. And as you said, without Frank Borman singularly, it wasn't just, Deke Slayton couldn't have done this. Any of his other colleagues, Wally Schirra could not have done this. Jim Lovell couldn't have done this. Without Frank both leading the investigation and going to North America, as you said, to redesign the cockpit or the capsule, this doesn't happen.
Think about the entire country. Every American knows of Apollo. Everybody is watching every step that they take. There's 400,000 Americans working on this program. There's 20,000 subcontractors to NASA, 20,000. So pretty much every corner of American society is in some way involved in Apollo. Everybody is watching. So this fire that happened at the end of January in 1967 just derailed everything. It was a simple, plugs out. They called it a plugs out test, communications test on the pad. And they know where the fire started, probably started under Gus Grissom's seat. They don't know how it started, Frank. They were never be able to say this exactly how it started. But those men died, very tragically. They knew that, Gus Grissom was famously interviewed saying, it's likely that someone is going to die. We're doing really dangerous stuff. Here we have, a rocket that's weighs 6.2 million pounds. And, even it's got, 6 million parts. So that fire, had the, everything that could go wrong went wrong and could have derailed and ended the whole program, because NASA was still behind in their mind, and they didn't know what was going on in Russia. They could have really, that's why they put so much emphasis into getting this program back on track. And they knew that Frank Borman was the guy. He was, he wasn't going to mess around in terms of, he wasn't going to, he's a hard taskmaster, and he's the epitome of a test pilot and engineer, and he is going to get it done. And his, his family sacrificed a lot for him to be away for those nearly 2 years while he did the investigation and was redesigning that Block 2 command module.
And that's the point, is this is zero sum. So while Frank is focused on basically America winning the space race, or the race to the moon in any case, his family is paying a heavy price. Susan's emotional state is getting more and more dire, and she's becoming a serious alcoholic. I mean, I guess she always was an alcoholic, but it's now manifesting itself in a way that is becoming problematic. And so Frank is Lisa, is the right word, oblivious to all of this at that point?
Yeah. And really, actually, Susan didn't start drinking in earnest until Ed died. And because they were so close with the Whites, Pat was her best friend. And she would go over every night after, because the boys were older at this point. So they were kind of, doing their own thing. And she would sit with Pat every night and essentially started grieving almost in advance, because in her mind, if this could happen to Ed, who was the poster boy of what an astronaut should be, he was bigger, he was stronger than Frank, he was incredibly intelligent, like he was the guy, the all-American astronaut. And it was the first time that Susan thought, my husband won't come out of this. She had always just put that to the side and just believed in Frank and his ability to handle any situation. But when Ed died and she sat with Pat night after night, and that's when they started drinking more, it just all hit her like, this will happen to me. This is going to happen to me.
But there was no outlet. She's not talking to a therapist. She's not, she's got just she and her circle, let's just say, suffering in silence.
Yeah.
Because they had to. That's what they viewed their duty, their role.
Exactly.
Obviously, as Americans, they understood how important their husband's work was. So she didn't want to be the issue. She didn't want to be something that derailed anything.
No.
But this is additive, right? It just keeps, if it's not dissipating, it's just starting to build up and build up and build up over these years. So let's fast forward to Frank's mission. So he's the lead for Apollo 8, which was the mission to actually go around the moon, not land on the moon, but actually circle on the moon. And that's where the title of the book comes from.
Yeah.
And so what were the details of that in terms of Frank first, Michael, and then let's talk about the way it affected Susan, and I'll turn to Lisa. So Michael, what were some of the things that Frank had to deal with during the preps and the actual execution of that mission?
Well, usually the lead up to any mission, there's about 18 months of training and preparation. These guys had 4 months. So they learned about, they got word from the CIA in August of '68 that the Russians were planning to do a Hail Mary flight around, just to go orbit the moon. Their launch window was in November, and I think it ended on December 7th. Frank and his crew had 4 months to train to fly. They're going to be the first astronauts, first human beings ever on the largest rocket that ever flew. So the Saturn V. So we're talking about a rocket that's, this as tall as a 36-story building. And they're going to be the first ones to fly it. The Saturn V had flown 2 unmanned flights to prove it out. The first one was highly successful. The second rocket, although it made to orbit, limped into orbit, and there was a lot of damage from the pogo effect during that flight. So when it came time for Frank to fly, and as Lisa mentioned, after Ed's death, she was convinced that here we're going to do something that no one has ever done before. Frank's going to command the first human mission on a Saturn V. They're going to be the first humans to leave Earth's gravitational influence. They're going to fly to the moon. If they get there, they have to enter orbit on the far side of the moon. So we're not going to know for 40 minutes whether the computer technology has worked, and the guys at MIT have got it right, and they've got into orbit successfully. They could have crashed on the far side. They could have been flown out into deep space. So everything about this mission was the first, and Susan was convinced that Frank wasn't going to come home. Chris Kraft said there's a 50-50 chance of this mission being successful. So right after they launched on December 21st on the winter solstice of 1968, Susan sat down and began to write Frank's eulogy.
And Frank had also written a letter to the family in the event that he didn't make it back, which is very poignant. So, Monica, you point out two things that are super important. One is you cannot overstate the enormity of the Saturn V craft. And I visited NASA during the shuttle program when I was the editor of Approach magazine in the early 90s, and they had a Saturn V sitting on its side, and they made a point of showing you just how gigantic in terms of thrust and size. And my parents lived not too far away from the Cape there, and we've been there when they did, like SpaceX will launch a rocket, and it, sort of seems kind of amazing and huge, but you can imagine the thunder associated with a Saturn V launch for that entire Central Florida area. I just can't even conceive of it. And so in terms of a human undertaking, we'll never see its like again, for one thing. The other is when we talk about, as you mentioned, we didn't know what would happen when you get to the dark side of the moon, the other side, in terms of the computing power and what the engineers had programmed. Because, as we like to say, our phones have more computing power than the Saturn V program did, even more than the shuttle did. But, what a flyer this whole thing was. So everybody was postured for failure. So, Lisa, what were some of the things that happened during this actual mission in terms of the focus? Again, the Klieg lights are on white hot.
Yeah.
Didn't NASA work some drug deal with Life magazine that gave them exclusive access, and the wives didn't really get any say in it, right? To Michael's point about you weren't resourced in terms of look and clothing, and you had to be style conscious, but you were on working on 03 or 04 pay. And so again, we didn't figure this out. The wives had to figure it out for themselves. So how was her mood, her demeanor, and the support mechanism during this crucial mission?
Well, she chose not to actually go to the launch and watched it from home, probably because she didn't want the backlash that she got from the Gemini flight. And yet she still had to invite not just Life magazine taking photos of her, but also a documentary team of filmmakers were in with the camera just zoomed into her face. She hadn't slept. She, as we mentioned, was convinced that Frank wasn't coming home. And my heart breaks every time I watch that footage, because you just see this woman who is desperately hanging on to anything she can to get through it, but she is absolutely terrified. And she's surrounded by a whole bunch of people who are cheering and, all excited about the launch. And she is just convinced that Frank is going to burn up either right when the launch happens or get lost in space. And it's so clear the difference between her demeanor and everyone that's around her. And it, again, her being real and being authentic, but she was absolutely terrified. And she looked like she was just heartbroken.
Well, we're just not wired for this,
No.
you know, and so it's going to manifest itself
Mhm.
in some way. But the
Right.
public circa 1968 had no capacity for this sort of empathy that she needed.
Yeah.
Right. This is very binary. And so the public's like, hey, your husband's a famous astronaut and, you know, your life is great. And that's it. The rest is things beyond our
Mhm.
understanding or even desire to know about you.
Yeah.
Right. That's just too much. It's like when somebody says, have a nice day or how's it going? You're like, well, I'm glad you asked because it's not going that great. You're like, no, I don't really want to know, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And so I just remember, you know, this monolithic view we all had of NASA. And I was a young schoolboy. I was in what, third grade. And, you know, my dad was a Marine Corps pilot and he'd sort of do some explaining of what's happening and that sort of thing. And there was no way for us to even wonder what's his wife going through?
Yeah.
You know, because my mom had suffered through my dad in Vietnam and so forth and so on. It was just like, put on a good face, shut it, you know, suck it up.
Yeah.
And, you know, the rest is your problem to deal with,
Mhm.
you know? And so he gets back from this mission. And now just to sort of fast forward a little bit, he starts to realize that she's not doing so good. And he makes a call to basically, you know, because he could have been one of the guys to walk on the moon.
Yeah.
And he makes the call that, okay, my wife and not my career. So talk to us about how that aha moment came about.
Well, he actually, as you mentioned, he was chosen to command Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong was his backup for Apollo 8. And when Frank turned it down, then they asked Neil to command Apollo 11. But Frank, in his mind, his mission was to beat the Russians. And he did it. So he didn't need to prove anything else because that was his mission. And he did recognize that his family was suffering. He knew he hadn't been home barely at all in the last few years. So he chose to turn down really the most iconic mission to the moon.
So that's certainly laudable. And obviously Frank is a man of great character.
Yes, he is.
And he knows what matters in life, and family is what matters.
Mhm.
So he made the call. The other thing, not just Susan's mental health and her alcoholism is getting worse. The boys were kind of getting into trouble. They were known as the bad kids in the neighborhood. And this reminds me of my life growing up on a Marine Corps air station, and the general's kids were always the wildest ones because their dad was never around, you know, and he had attended to his career. And so I get it. And so did Frank go right to Eastern Airlines? Was that his first job out of the NASA program, or how did he wind up being the president of Eastern Airlines?
Well, he stuck around because he got his Air Force wings in 1950. Susan pinned his wings on, and then so he wanted to get his 20 years in. So he stuck around until 1970. He was actually in the Oval Office with President Nixon during the Apollo 11 landing to advise the president. And him and Susan actually became close friends with the Nixons. But he left in NASA in 70, and then joined Eastern Airlines.
So he kind of jumps out of the frying pan and into the fire. You know, they moved to Miami, which is where the headquarters of Eastern Airlines is. And I can hear a lot of the young people like, what's Eastern Airlines, right? It was this airline that existed back in our day that was a major carrier, you know, and it was one of the big ones.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't start as the head, but he fleets up pretty fast.
Yeah.
And again, they realize that, okay, now dad's sense of duty is kicking in again. Mm-hmm. He's trying to keep, like he saved NASA, he's trying to save Eastern Airlines, and they're having labor disputes, and, you know, it's not an easy gig.
And of course, because Frank is wired the way he is and so mission driven, he didn't really understand the challenge that he was taking on when he took that job. And because he just had to be with Susan. She actually wanted to stay back in Houston. Their youngest was finishing high school, and he begged her to come to Miami. And so Edwin actually lived with his parents that last year, and Fred was already at West Point. So all of a sudden, Susan is now in Miami with no friends, no support, no boys that she needs to be strong for. And that's kind of when everything really starts to unravel, because Frank is never home again, and she's by herself and really with nothing to be present for, strong for. And that's when the alcoholism really becomes prevalent.
Yeah, that part of the story jumped out at me, where Frank kind of demands that she come to Miami, fully knowing that the family situation would probably best if she stayed in Houston. And so he struck me at that moment as a little bit needy. Like, his emotional needs were pry one. And so again, being the dutiful wife, she does it. But as you mentioned, Lisa, this is just the beginning of an even darker period. So ultimately, how does he discover just how bad this has become for Susan?
Well, Susan was, again, because she was such an amazing woman, and it was so hardwired into her to be there for everyone. No one actually knew that she had a drinking problem. She was amazing at hiding it, and she made sure that, like Frank told me, he had never seen her drunk, but she was a very functional alcoholic. But when it all kind of came to a head is she had been by herself. Frank was somewhere at a different Eastern, I think he was in possibly New York at that time, doing whatever he was doing for Eastern. And so she was by herself in the apartment, and Fred was coming home from West Point for a visit. And obviously that would be something that she would be pardon the phrase, over the moon about. But the alcoholism was becoming so bad, and she was drinking all day because she was lonely, and she had no one to really talk to or be with, that actually Fred came home and found her totally unresponsive on the couch, and he had to call 911, and they came and got her. And that was when it really was apparent to everyone in the family that there was a big problem. And she then ended up going to a facility, kind of a rehab facility, but it was more about just healing all of the stuff that she had been pushing down her whole life. And she was gone for 4 months.
Right. Again, we're talking about, this is the 1970s.
Yes.
So we don't have the Gucci rehabs that we have now. And so this is kind of, when we say healing facility, this is a mental hospital.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And it feels kind of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest-ish at this point. So Frank realizes he's putting his wife into a mental hospital.
Yeah.
Under the auspices of alcoholism and emotional whatever. Yeah. So you can just imagine the challenges to him.
Yes.
Again, he's got to come to terms that his life isn't perfect.
No.
And that's not something that these guys are generally good with.
No.
And then she has some moments where she's like demanding to get let out, and they're not ready to let her out. And so that's another thing that Frank has to, like, dropping your kid off at daycare and they don't want to go.
Yeah.
It's always challenging. So those moments really jumped out at me. Like another lesson. And look, life is not easy, even if you're Frank Borman, and you got to deal with it. And ultimately they did. But wow, this period particularly was just when you thought they had nothing left to do except enjoy the autumn of their lives. Yes. It got super challenging.
Yeah, it did. And just like most things that are really challenging, because of the way that they both approached it, they became so much better for it, not just personally, but also as a couple. And that was when Frank had to do something he had never done before, which is go internal. He had to talk about his feelings. He had to acknowledge all of the ways that he had contributed to Susan's suffering, the negligence, the mission above all else mentality, and really come to terms with some of these things that he realized he took her for granted. He took for granted that she was always going to be this strong, stoic woman who would always support him in everything he did. And he didn't understand the price she paid for that until this happened.
To his credit, he did cop to all those things.
He did.
Because he didn't have to.
No.
Right. And men of lesser character, high profile men of lesser character would not have done that.
No.
And so, as we know, and as you describe in the book, Frank Borman is a great man over everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really a love story, an unorthodox one, but a love story at its core.
Yeah.
So Susan died.
She passed away this last September. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
and Frank is still alive. And
yes,
as
he
you
is.
guys mentioned, is he still flying his airplane, or is he not now been grounded? Because he was until very recently. I mean, what is he, 94, 95 years old now, and he was still flying until very recently.
Yeah, he actually, it was heartbreaking. He called me. It was right after Susan passed. And the two things he loved in life was her and flying. And he sold his plane right after she died. But he had been flying right up until that point. And he turned 94 this March. So he's amazing. He's amazing.
So the book is called Far Side of the Moon, Apollo 8 Commander Frank Borman and the Woman Who Gave Him Wings. The author is Lisa Jorgensen. Her husband, Michael, is the president of Myth Merchant Films. Guys, thanks for coming by the channel, and thanks for writing this book.
Thank you so much, Ward. This was so much fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Ward.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Check the links below for merch, including where you can get the Slava Ukraini t-shirts. All profits support the Ukrainian military in their fight against the Russian invasion. Also, if you enjoy my channel and you have not read the Punks trilogy, you're kind of missing a big part of the picture. Because you guys asked for it, you can now get Punk's War, Wing, and Fight, not just in print, but also as a Kindle and an audiobook. So check the links below for all of those details. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again soon.